Shalom, welcome to Torah Talk with Tamar, where I discuss the Hebrew Bible from a scholastic point of view with a special emphasis on the Torah, the first 5 books, as they're usually referred to as the Pentateuch, and where I also invite others to come and discuss as well in a civilized, respectful, and safe place. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you can continue to participate and be invited to these discussions. Today, I want to focus on a little bit of a segmented topic in the Hebrew Bible, but a very profound one. It's very important, and it's known across most religions in one form or another as a very important topic, and that is the topic of the widow and fatherless. And I want to specifically dive in today over what exactly the Hebrew Bible defines as the widow and fatherless. And when we translate these words to English, we sometimes lose the deeper meaning and understanding of words, and in doing that, we lose the instructions and commands that we were given to follow. So who are the widow and fatherless? We catch the definition of this in Exodus chapter 22. And I want to read this word for word in here to establish that the Torah defines a widow and fatherless, which I'm also going to share the Hebrew words for, so we can work towards a proper and exact definition. So in Exodus 22, it states that the threshold for a woman to be a widow and for children to be fatherless is that the husband has to have died, has suffered a death, completely dead. You could say that a number of ways. And I'm working towards saying that different ways to maintain sensitivity to the issue. The same for the children. In order for a child to be considered fatherless, by definition of the Torah in the Hebrew Bible, their father would have had to have passed away and be dead. And the Hebrew word for widow given there in Exodus 22 is almanah. And the Hebrew word for fatherless there in Exodus 22 is yathum. So throughout the Hebrew Bible, when you see almanah and yathum, it is specifically referring to a woman whose husband has died and a child whose father has died. And they receive a specific hedge around them, because once the husband and the father have transitioned from the land of the living over to being permanently gone in the physical sense, they are considered to be in a very vulnerable and capricious situation. This is different than, let's say, a divorce or abandonment or an unknown time period of abandonment or estrangement altogether, in which case when the husband or the father is roaming around in the land of the living, there is still hope for restoration, hope for reconciliation, or even seeing them periodically from time to time. But once the husband and father has died and there is no hope of reconciliation, no hope of restoration, no hope of them returning, it becomes a very final situation that can cause the wife and the children a tremendous amount of grief. And I say the word sometimes, but it's generally 99% of the time, even in marriages that had trouble or people who might have been temporarily separated, and widows across the board who have lost a husband in so many ways. It really doesn't matter how angry they were. When somebody dies, it transforms the relationship tragically and traumatically. And for that reason, the Creator gave a specific hedge around that household, which also shows a particular form of connection to the husband. That hedge is also to preserve his household as well. that is left behind in the nation of Israel. So let's take a step back and read Exodus 22. And depending on your translation, this might start at verse 21, 22, or 23. So in this particular translation that I'm reading, it's going to start at 22. And it says, "You shall not afflict any yathum or almanah." And I'm going to translate this as in bilingual translation as we're reading, because this one says orphan, and orphan does a lot of disservice to this passage. In English, an orphan is somebody who doesn't have a father or a mother, and they do need compassion and care, but this in the Torah is actually a thum here. "If you afflict him, if he at all cries to me, I will surely hear his cry. And my anger shall glow, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become almanah, and your sons or children will be yathum." So to rise to the threshold of being considered a widow or almanah in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah, it means the husband has died. And to rise to the level of being a yathum, that is a child whose father has died. And that's a particular situation. So throughout the world, there are many ministries and charities for orphans, and there are many ministries claiming to care for the fatherless. And a lot of times, these ministries are caring for people whose father is estranged from them, or is not doing his duty as a father, or who has abandoned them for some unknown time. And this is a very difficult situation that absolutely deserves compassion and care to these households. And the same for orphans who have lost both their father and their mother. They need care and compassion and food, just as many vulnerable populations need. And the Torah gives us a way to care for the poor through loans, gifts, and through food. But I think there needs to be a distinction drawn between compassion and a hedge. Because when we stretch the definition of the word fatherless to mean anybody who's having a difficult time with their father, this robs true widows and true fatherless, or almanah and yathum, of their rights and their place in the eyes of the Creator. It's not a competition of who is going through the most grief. It's not a competition of which tragedy is worse. Each has its own complexities and heartaches, but death is its own unique experience. Death is not the same as abandonment. Death is not the same as estrangement, and death is not the same as divorce. And this is why even the English language and nearly every language across the board has a different word for death: abandonment, divorce, and estrangement, because each of these are describing a particularly unique experience. And in order to validate the feelings of a person being abandoned or estranged or divorced or going through a death, it's important to recognize that they're not all going through the same experience. Because when we say that somebody is a widow or fatherless and they haven't experienced a death, it invalidates widows who have gone through the process of burying their spouse, who discovered their spouse dead. There's many scenarios that we could describe. But a widow has permanently been separated by the wall of death between her in the land of the living and her husband in another place. And whether that's in soul sleep or that soul is still wandering the land of the living is another video. But it's important to maintain the proper definition of widow and fatherless so that the hedge that is to be around widows and their children, yathum, is maintained. Because to encroach on that hedge, and I'm going to talk about that hedge a little bit more, is to encroach upon their rights and what they're going through as the widow and the fatherless. So throughout the Torah and the prophets, which encompasses a large portion of the Hebrew Bible, there is a moral obligation of the people of Israel to hedge in the widow. And that is a hedge of a few things. One, as we saw in Exodus 22, is not to afflict them. So there have been sages who have expanded on this probably better than I can right now. But the idea is that you don't put undue hardship on a widow and her children, because that would be afflicting them. Withholding food, chastising them unnecessarily hard, being harsh in words, withdrawing their tithes, taunting them, mocking them. All these sorts of things are a form of affliction that are specifically forbidden in Exodus 22. In Deuteronomy 27, there is a curse that the people of the nation of Israel are to put on proactively on anybody who interferes with righteousness for almanah and yathum, for the widow and fatherless. And it said, a curse be upon anybody who interferes with this righteousness for the gers, which are the people coming home to Israel that were not born in the land, and two other populations, widows and the widow's children, the fatherless, yathum. And when we get into the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and some of the minor prophets like Zechariah and Malachi and Lamentations, there is a consistent theme of chastising the children of Israel for oppressing the widows and the fatherless, for denying them their rights, for robbing them, and for not caring for them properly. This denial of the rights of the widow and fatherless is one of the reasons that the Most High punished the children of Israel and drove them out of the land and struck them. And in those passages in the major prophets and the minor prophets, they are admonished to plead for the widow, to defend the widow, to preserve the rights of the fatherless, and to treat them better if they wanted to repent. And in order to preserve this hedge, in going with these admonitions and prophecies that the nation of Israel received, in order to continue that in our modern era, this requires us to preserve the proper definition of widow and fatherless. Because when we stretch those definitions to mean things that they don't mean, we're guilty of doing what our ancestors in the nation of Israel did as well. They encroached and denied the rights. Well, let me phrase that better. They encroached upon and denied the rights of widows and the widow's children, yathum. So, what is the value of a definition? It has a tremendous value and a tremendous application. Because if we don't define widows as women whose husbands have died, and if we don't preserve the definition of fatherless as the children whose father has died, then we're not giving them the care that is due to them in the Torah. And that care is a duty not to afflict them, a duty to tithe to them food, including animals, crops, fruit trees, and grain, and olives and wine. It's also a duty not to take their garments as collateral for a loan, and a duty to give them wholeheartedly, of which is not an exact number, but an offering from our hearts to the widow and widow's children, yathum, of gold, silver, bronze, yarn, oils, spices, wood, and furs. And I may have missed one or two things, but they're listed in Exodus 25, 1 through 7, and again in Exodus 35. It asks that the people of Israel bring these things to give to Elohim. And then Deuteronomy 26:13 expands, going forward in that verse, to say that those things that were brought to Elohim, the gold, the silver, the bronze, etc., that I listed before, were to be given to the Levites the gers coming home to Israel that were not born there, the widows, almanah, and the widows' children, yathum. So the nation of Israel has an obligation to tithe these things to the household of the widows, almanah, and the fatherless, yathum. And to not give the tithe appropriately in the proper direction is another form of inadvertently robbing the widows and the yathum of their rights. So this proper approach towards defining widows and fatherless properly within the Hebrew context has a tremendous application in our modern lives. Thank you for joining me today on a topic that has tremendous application in our modern world as we continue to see the plight of widows and their children around the world, which is very heavy and grievous in some countries, worse than others. And I encourage you and I challenge you to look into the Hebrew definition of widow and fatherless on your own free time as well, beyond this video. And I also encourage you to care for the widows and fatherless throughout the world, and firstly in your local community. Shalom.